noticed something last couple weeks driving between Syracuse and Napanee? I'm seeing a lot of brand new metal electric poles laying on the ground all up the road. That means that there's going to be a lot of stop and go traffic on Highway 6 this spring. And Kevin, you'll probably be going down 1350 again, won't you? Yeah. Detours. That's what this message is about today. Detours can be aggravating, but we all have to learn to deal with them. And as you get out your swords this morning, we're going to cover about 3 chapters. If you want to get out your swords and turn to Genesis chapter 30 today. And speaking of detours, next Sunday is Palm Sunday, the start of Holy Week. So we will resume our Genesis walk after Easter. Well, last week, where was we last week? We saw Jacob getting married to Leah and Rachel, sisters, after getting conned into it by Laban, their father. And the result was that old Jacob, he had to work 14 years in exchange for permission to marry them both. Really, though, he only wanted to marry Leah. Now, as we saw in previous sessions, Jacob himself was rather, kind of a scoundrel, a little bit of a rascal in his earlier days. But he was determined now. He was determined to do right. He didn't always hit the bullseye, but he worked hard, served his uncle Laban well, and in the coming years he would make Laban a very wealthy man. And Jacob himself was no slouch in this. He built a substantial wealth for himself as well. But while Jacob was busy succeeding in business, things weren't going so well at home. The sisters he had married did not get along with one another. They were both jealous. They were both insecure. Not both of them knew that Rachel was his favorite, but she wasn't able to have children right away. And Leah had given birth to 4 sons. Rachel still hadn't had one. And she complained to Jacob about it. And he says, in effect, look, this isn't my fault and it isn't my problem, so stop complaining. Rachel, remember, was his favorite. Yikes. But he wasn't exactly Mr. Comfort when she came to him with her troubles, was he? So Rachel, what does she decide to do? She gave him one of her servants to bear children in her place. Bilhah was her name. This was an ancient custom. We saw the same strategy with Sarah and Hagar weeks before. So Jacob, he fathered some sons with Bilhah. Well, Leah, she doesn't want to get outdone here. So she gives Jacob her servant Zilpah, who also gave birth to a couple sons. And then at last, Rachel gave birth to a son named Joseph. And he would always be Jacob's favorite. Jacob soon found himself with 4 wives and 11 sons, and a whole lot of stress at work, and a whole lot of conflict at home. Now, he continued working for Laban, but he wasn't getting paid for what he thought he should get paid. And Laban was Laban. Always trying to manipulate labor agreements to benefit himself, In spite of this, Jacob always seemed to get the upper hand. And eventually, even Laban realized that it was because God was blessing Jacob. But finally, after 20 years of a detour in this area, Jacob had enough. So let's go to chapter 31, and we're going to look at the first few verses. I love to hear the pages turn. Now Jacob heard what Laban's sons were saying. Jacob has taken all that was our father's and has built his wealth from what belonged to our father. And Jacob saw from Laban's face that his attitude toward him was not the same as before. The Lord said to him, "Go back to the land of your ancestors and to your family, and I will be with you." Now go on down to verse 12. "For I have seen all that Laban has been doing to you. I am the God of Bethel, where you poured oil on the stone marker and made a solemn vow to me. Get up, leave this land, and return to your native land." Now, what's Jacob got to do? He's got to tell Rachel and Leah. And he tells them about his plans, and their response was, in effect, "That's fine with us. Our father doesn't treat us very well either, so we don't have any inheritance to look forward to, so let's pack our bags and get out of Dodge." Easier said than done. Jacob knew that Laban would not want them to leave. So he waited until Laban was away from home before he packed up his family, his flocks, his herds, his possessions, and get them all loaded up and took off. They took off. They began the 400-mile journey back to the land of Canaan. Now, let's go down to verse 22 in chapter 31. On the third day, Laban was told that Jacob had fled. So he took his relatives with him, pursued Jacob for 7 days, and overtook him in the hill country of Gilead. But God came to Laban, the Aramean, in a dream at night. "Watch yourself," God warned him. "Don't say anything to Jacob, either good or bad." Now, folks, that dream prevented Laban from being violent with Jacob. But Laban being Laban, it did not stop him from trying to play his usual mind games. Can you imagine? Why did you sneak away? Why didn't you just say you wanted to leave? I would have let you go. I would have given you a farewell feast. Hey, why didn't you let me kiss my daughters and my grandsons goodbye, sneaking off like you did? Of course, Jacob knew that Laban wouldn't have done any of those things, because he knew from experience that Laban could not be trusted. Now, Jacob was growing in this whole area of being a peacemaker. But he had finally got a backbone. He held his ground. He said, "Look, I worked hard for you for 20 years. I cared for your flocks under harsh conditions. In all of our business dealings, I always gave you the advantage. You never promised to pay. You never paid what you promised to pay. You treated me not like a son, but a slave." And then, look at verse 42 with me. I'm going to use the old NIV on this one. "If the God of my father, the God of Abraham and the fear of Isaac had not been with me, you would surely have sent me away empty-handed. But God has seen my hardship and the toil of my hands. And last night he rebuked you." Hey, Jacob's getting a backbone here. The two men were then able to come to peaceful terms. One of the detours of life is almost over for Jacob. The next day, Laban said a final farewell to his daughters, his grandsons, and Jacob and his family continued on their journey. One down, but there's one to go. He needed to turn his attention to yet another painful part of his past. The situation with who? Esau, his brother. The one who wanted to kill him earlier. And Jacob, he wants to reconcile now. Let's get that taken care of, So he sent messengers ahead to reach out to Esau, saying, basically, I want to make peace with you, my brother. Well, the messengers came back after a few days and said, hey, Esau's got your message, and he's on his way to meet you. Him and about 400 soldiers of his. Oh, okay. Not the response Jacob hoped to get. So we began to separate his family into two different camps, and in case one was attacked, the other might be able to get away. And then Jacob prayed. In chapter 32 now, verses 9 through 12. Jacob said, God of my father Abraham and God of my father Isaac, the Lord who said to me, go back to your land and to your family, and I will cause you to prosper. I am unworthy of all the kindness and faithfulness you have shown your servant. Indeed, I crossed over the Jordan with my staff, and now I have become two camps. Please rescue me from my brother Esau, for I am afraid of him. Otherwise he may come and attack me, the mothers and their children. You said I will cause you to prosper, and I will make your offspring like the sand of the sea, too numerous to be counted. He sends his messengers ahead of him. Again, this time with gifts and of his flocks and his herds, hoping just to calm Esau down. And this is where the story takes a bizarre turn. After Jacob kind of sends his family on up ahead, he decides to spend the night alone at the camp. Now let's go to Genesis chapter 32, verse 24, and in our minds, let's kind of gather around a campfire for just a little bit. Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until daybreak. When the man saw that he could not defeat him, he struck Jacob's hip socket as they wrestled and dislocated his hip. Then he said to Jacob, let me go, for it is daybreak. But Jacob said, I will not let you go unless you bless me. What is your name? The man asked. Jacob, he replied. Your name will no longer be Jacob, he said. It will be Israel, because you have struggled with God and with men and have prevailed. Then Jacob asked him, please tell me your name. But he answered, why do you ask my name? And he blessed him there. Jacob then named the place Peniel, for I have seen God face to face. He said, yet my life has been spared. The sun shone on him as he passed by Peniel, limping because of his hip. Whoa! What does that mean? Who was the man that Jacob wrestled? Was it God in the form of a man? Or it seems to imply that, doesn't it? But if it was God in the form of a man, there's some problems here, isn't there? How could he not defeat Jacob if he was God? And why would he ask Jacob his name? The answer is found in the book of Hosea. It's always best to let the Bible answer the Bible, and here it is. Hosea 12, verses 3 and 4, talking about Jacob. In the womb he grasped his brother's heel, and as an adult he wrestled with God. Jacob struggled with the angel and prevailed. He wept and sought his favor. He found him at Bethel, and there he spoke with him. You know, it's interesting, as you read God's words, there's always some intentional mystery involved, isn't there? And I always see that as fascinating. You know, that intentional hiddenness that God mixes in. we see in these historical narratives of Genesis is, they record actual events, but there's always a great deal of symbolism as well. While Jacob wrestled with this man, God appeared to him. You could say that Jacob wrestled with God his entire life, couldn't you? And we can probably relate to that in many ways. Resisting and yielding, failing and succeeding, trusting sometimes and doubting sometimes, trying and failing and succeeding some more, and on and on. For Jacob, it was a lifelong struggle. So yes, in a sense, he does struggle with God. He sees the face of God. And how does he come out of the battle? Well, he comes out broken. He comes out limping. But I tell you what, he comes out blessed. And it's worth a limp. It's worth brokenness if you can come out blessed. Chapter 33 now. You can imagine now the sunrise as a backdrop. As Jacob, he's limping along now, catching up with his brood and rejoining his family. See, he's got another detour on the horizon here. And he sees Esau coming with his 400 guys. Man, it looks dangerous. So Jacob divides his wives and children into groups, and he went on ahead to meet Esau. You think your heart might be beating a little faster at that point? I'm sure it was. But as he approached him, Jacob bowed to the ground as a sign of respect, as a demonstration of peace. And Esau then ran to Jacob, embraced him, kissed him, and they both cried. And Jacob said, "What a relief it is to see your friendly smile. It is like seeing the face of God." Two brothers at last make peace. After 20 years of anger and resentment and fear and strife, all was forgiven. Now Esau, he invites Jacob to travel the rest of the way with him, and Jacob respectfully declines. He went a slightly different direction, arrives at Shechem, and he settles there, and so now the 400-mile journey is complete. The home of Abraham and Isaac is now also the home of Jacob, and what would be the 12 tribes, just like God had promised. And the Bible says in verse 20, and he set up an altar there and called it El Elohe Israel, the God of Israel. Now that's all introduction. We got to get to our points here. I'll do it quickly for us. What can we learn from Jacob's journey? I tell you what, we're all like, I saw myself in this. We're all like Jacob in some sense. Sometimes before you can take a journey into the future, you kind of got to take a journey through the past. So even though Jacob had for 20 years been growing a family, building a fortune, he was also spinning his wheels. So Laban's lessons and Esau's lessons were detours that he had to take. Ever feel like your life's taking a detour? That happens when you know that God has something a little different planned for you. And you know that what you're experiencing today isn't it. You know in the deepest part of you, God has something more for me. There's something different on the horizon. And I'm ready to move forward. I'm ready to get back to the future that he has. Now, if you want your life to move in the direction that God's planned for you, in the direction of a future filled with blessing and abundance and peace and fulfillment, there's 3 lessons that we can easily learn from Jacob's life here. If you've ever felt like your life has taken a detour, these 3 lessons will help you get back on the path. First of all, you need to break away from that which is holding you back. Oh, Jacob. He was good for Laban, but Laban wasn't good for Jacob. Neither was he good for his own daughters. Laban, he was a manipulator, a user, a schemer. He was a con man. He was a trickster. He was the kind of guy who would say, oh, Jacob, after all I've done for you, how could you treat me this way? That's Laban. Bet you know the type. We know, of course, who benefited most from this relationship. Well, it was Laban. It was always Laban. That's why, really, it finally came to a point in Jacob's life where his only reasonable option was to separate himself from that abuse and move on. For 20 years, that region of Paddan Aram was never a good fit for Jacob. He should have got Rachel and got out of Dodge. If he would have got back to Canaan a little earlier, we don't know. He might have been a better father. He might have had a more structured environment in which to raise those kids. Who knows? But I'm saying if you want to move full speed ahead into your future, you've got to make the difficult decision to let go of that which is holding you back. And for many, it's time to stop playing the victim and work together to build up the kingdom of God. Now, here's the second back to the future little lesson we can learn from Jacob's life, and it's this. You need to wrestle with God and lose. The Christian life is a struggle. Spiritual growth is a struggle. It's not for wussies. It doesn't come easy. And it never comes quickly. It's a lifelong process. And at this point of the story, of course, it's been 20 years. Jacob's still got a long way to go. But we do see some signs of growth here. You see, if we remember back, Jacob, what did Jacob depend on? Well, he depended on his wits. He depended on his charm. He depended on his physical strength. And as he matured, how did he change? He learned to recognize the hand of God in his success. He learned to pray when he needed help. He learned to thank God when the blessings came. And after spending the night alone in camp when Jacob wrestled with the angel, he also learned to lose. He learned to surrender. I tell you, thanks to our sinful nature, we find ourselves often struggling with God every step of the way. We also need to learn to lose, to surrender, and say, okay, Lord, what is your will in this? The Bible says that the man touched Jacob's hip, wrenching it from the socket. And because of this injury, I tell you, he walked with a limp. As far as we know, he walked with a limp the rest of his days. And yet at the same time, he walked in greater power than he ever did before, under the fullness of God's blessing. You know how to recognize God's most gifted leaders? They walk with a limp. Many times they too have spent a lifetime struggling with God, but they've learned how to surrender. And by necessity, they've learned a new way of walking. Now here's the third lesson, very quickly. You need to balance yesterday's books. Now what do I mean by that? Have you ever pled for mercy? Tuesday night, Cindy and I is going to take our tax forms into our tax lady. That's always a fun time, So I'm used to pleading for mercy, But Jacob, he couldn't return to his homeland without taking a detour. and face Esau. Couldn't do it. And you can't move into your future without fully resolving messes that you might have made in the years previous. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus said, if you're offering your gift on the altar and there you remember that your brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift there in front of the altar. First go and be reconciled with your brother or sister, and then come and offer your gift. Detours. Oh, that's a blessed detour. You can't move into the full blessing of God if you haven't fully owned up to your past. To whatever extent it is possible for you to do. Step 9 of the 12 steps to recovery says it this way. Make direct amends to such people whenever possible, except when to do so would injure them or others. So let me ask, are there books you need to balance? Are there books you need to balance? Is there a breach you need to repair? You can't avoid it forever. So if you want to move forward in your life, you need to be ready to fully reconcile with the past. You know, Jacob, he arrived in Canaan. We know that the drama's not over yet. There's still some heartbreak to come for Jacob. Because that, I tell you, that's life. There's no getting around that. But we do see in Jacob's story today a marvelous transformation. He went from being a conniver to a man fully committed to God. And this is the plan that God had for him all along. Jacob was able to get back on track. He made it around the detours. And the same can be true for you. So before you put the past behind you, you have to be willing to put it in front of you and deal with it. I tell you, sometimes the bridges that were burnt need to be rebuilt for the sake of healing and for the kingdom to grow. Let's stand for prayer today. Gave you a lot to chew on today. And